we can get started. And it's recording. Awesome. But I guess we could do our normal thing of going around and just saying our name and our affiliate, who we work for, or whatever. So I can start, and then I think we pretty much see everybody. I'll just call out names. So Renee St. Jacques, Associate Director of Public Policy at New York Farm Bureau and Chair of ISAC. Christopher, you want to go next?
Sure, I'm Christopher Williams from the Capital Region PRISM. I'm the Invasive Species Coordinator in our region, and I am the PRISM representative for ISAC. I'm filling in or taking over Rob Williams' position, and Rob is here. I'll let him go next.
Congratulations, Christopher. Rob Williams, I'm the Nature Conservancy representative, also the manager of the SLELO PRISM. Next.
Carrie, you want to go next?
Sure, I'm Carrie Brown Lima, and I'm the director of the New York Invasive Species Research Institute. I'm the Cornell rep on the ISAC, and I'm also the vice chair of ISAC.
Okay. George? Oh, you're still on mute, George.
There we go. You got me?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, I'm George Robinson, representing UAlbany and the Biodiversity Research Institute, and I'm at home and I'm wearing pants.
Meg?
Good morning, Meg Mudley with the Lake Champlain Basin Program and New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission, Aquatic Invasive Species Management Coordinator.
Thanks. Beth?
SME, New York State Turfgrass Association and Council of Ag Organization.
Good to see you. Caitlin?
Great, just unmuted myself. Caitlin Stewart, representing the New York State Conservation District Employees Association. Good morning, all.
Morning. John?
Yeah, John Bartow. I'm the executive director of the Empire State Forest Products Association.
Good to see you. Mike?
Mitchell, New York State Flower Industries.
Molly?
Hi folks, this is Molly Hassett. I'm with the Invasive Species Coordination Section at DEC.
Great. Meredith?
Hi, Meredith Taylor with New York City Department of Environmental Protection, and I represent water suppliers and I work on the upstate watershed lands for New York City.
Great. Alan?
Hey, good morning, everyone. This is Alan Gosser. I'm the State Director for USDA Wildlife Services.
Thanks. Hugh? Hugh? Unmute.
Hugh, if you can hear us, you're up. Just unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, this is Hugh Cannon with the, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, I don't see my picture up, but that's, anyway, the host has asked you to start your video. Yes, sorry.
There you go.
There we go, okay. I'm Hugh Cannon with the New York Forest Owners Association.
Okay. Good to see you. Justin?
Hi everyone, it's Justin Perry with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Good to see everybody.
Good to see you. DJ? There she is.
Hi, DJ Evans, Director of the New York Natural Heritage Program.
Thanks. Jesse?
Jesse Lepak. I'm with New York Sea Grant. I'm the Great Lakes Fisheries and Ecosystem Health Specialist.
Thanks. Dick Powell?
Dick Powell. I'm representing the New York Upstate Chapter, the American Society of Landscape Architects.
Thank you. I think that's Tom.
Tom Algeier, New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets, Invasive Species Coordinator.
Jennifer?
Hi, it's Jennifer Dean with the New York National Heritage Program. I'm the invasive species biologist for the IMAP invasives team.
Thank you. And Christopher?
Yeah, this is Chris Abel. I'm the coordinator for the Pennsylvania Invasive Species Council.
Thanks. And Dave? Oh, I got unmuted. There you go.
Good morning, Dave Adams here with the New York State DEC.
Great. And Carl?
I'm sorry, did you say Carl?
Yep.
Oh, sorry. Carl Schoberl here with the Environmental Energy Alliance of New York.
Great, thank you. All right, I think that's everybody. So, thanks for going through all that. I'm gonna double check. I'm pretty sure I think we have quorum, but as I'm checking that, and then if you can just keep in mind just to try and mute yourself when you're not talking, and Dave and Carl, I mean, if we get any feedback, I'll mute you, or we'll mute you, but it seems to be going okay right now, so, or you can also mute yourselves, hopefully, have that ability on your phone. Any announcements and updates that anyone would like to share before we get going? Especially on how ISAW went too, if anybody has updates to share on that.
Hi folks, this is Molly. So we had our 7th annual Invasive Species Awareness Week, June 7th to June 13th this year. Just about, I think maybe even all of the events were hosted online this year, and some of them were even hosted over social media challenges across the state. I'm still putting together all of the results from ISAW, but it's looking like we had a fewer number of events total across the state this year, but each event itself overall had more participants, which kind of makes sense because a lot of people tend to attend webinars and such. So continuing to put that together, and hopefully I'll be able to send even more results from ISAW in, I guess, the coming weeks around to folks.
Great. Thanks, Molly.
Renee, this is Beth. I don't know if this is the appropriate time, but I do have a short thing to talk about as far as pesticide recertification credits. And would you rather?
No, that's fine.
Do it?
Fine?
Go ahead. Okay. Because of all the virtual meetings that we're now having and the lack of in-person meetings, DEC has allowed us to start doing webinars that will be credited for pesticide recertification licenses. And the New York State Turfgrass Association has put together a technology expert to sort of lead our transition into doing these kinds of webinars. And I just bring this up because if any associations are interested in in that kind of thing where they want to do webinars, and eventually we're going to do them in sort of on-site type webinars first, and then we're also going to set up a store of webinars for credits. So this might be something that other people are interested in, and I just wanted to let everybody know that we're moving forward with this kind of technology. So get in touch with me if you have any questions. Thank you.
Beth, Rob here. So is there something you could send out to us so that we could share it for folks looking for credits, or are you not at that point yet?
We're not, you're right. We're not quite at that point yet. We're just demoing probably this week. But as soon as I do have something, I will send it out, Rob. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Beth. Anybody else have any updates or announcements to share? It looks like I think we have 15 members, ISAC members, so I think that's quorum, right? Because I think we have to have just over 14. So if we can vote, which I think we can, in the revised open meeting law for like during COVID, it says you have to post it, like make the meeting information available beforehand, which we kind of did, kind of didn't. But also the main thing is to post the recording and the transcription afterwards of the meeting. And that's something that I think we can do, I hope. So, but we can vote anyway on minutes, and if it doesn't count, it doesn't count, but at least we can do it just in case. But yeah, so if there's no other announcements or anything, we can move on to minutes. And did everybody get that hopefully beforehand and review it?
Yes.
And there was one revision that I think it was from Carl. I sent over to Christopher, minor revision.
And I forgot what that revision was, sorry.
I think it's just to delete a sentence out of there. Yeah, from Carl, just when he was, says he asked about climate-related members being added to ISAC, and just that doesn't remember that happening. Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, just I wasn't sure I specifically had recommended. I think the way it was worded in there was I recommended that some climate-related members be added in it. I'm not sure it was that. I think it was just more of a general comment about consideration of climate change impacts and discussions of invasive species, but not so much per se adding yeah, I'm not sure what I read that I wasn't sure what that meant or who it would be added. So I don't think I was thinking about it in those terms. So you could just leave that out.
Okay. Any other revisions for the minutes? I just need a motion.
This is Caitlin Stewart. I'll make the motion to accept the previous meeting minutes with the amendment, with the change.
Second.
Second that, please.
So motion by Caitlin and second by Mike.
Thank you.
Any discussion? All those in favor, I guess, say yes.
Aye.
Aye.
Yeah.
Aye.
Aye.
Right. Any opposed? Awesome. Okay, thank you.
Just one more time, who was the person that second?
Mike Mitchell.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. And then if you, Christopher, you could do the PRISM update, and can you share your screen with the PRISM highlights? Or?
I should be able to share my screen. I just need a moment because it's not always the smoothest transition.
And we'll send this out to everybody too afterwards.
Integrated webcam. Share screen. All right. Can everybody see the PRISM highlight sheet?
Looks good.
Yes.
Right. I'm working right out of a PDF. Sorry, it may not be the smoothest transition. I want to thank everybody very much for joining us today. PRISM highlights. Due to the nature of the rescheduling of the meeting, I had put out a call 7 days ago. There were a few folks that were unable because of massive constraints with training or being furloughed with getting all of the reports in. But we have a majority of them. If I get a few extras in, I will definitely post them and make sure we get a final out for everyone. But I'll start with a highlight from an update from the Adirondack PRISM. Tamara Van Ryan has a fully staffed crew. She now has a new education and communications coordinator. Her name is Emily Bell Lianen. She also has a new terrestrial invasive species project coordinator, Becca Bernacki. As you know, Zach Semenik has moved on with the Nature Conservancy, being GIS specialist. And also Aaron Volrath has recently celebrated 6 years as the Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator for APIP. Also, APIP has their 4-person early detection and rapid response crew up and running for both the terrestrial and aquatic invasive species program. And I also am aware that they do have their DEC campground seasonal crew member working, checking the highly probable areas for trails and those big campgrounds. APIP had a successful couple of events virtually. They had over 150 attendees training for 2 events during ISAC week. They have launched a new website, and they have also installed 3 new boot brush stations since their last report. On the other perspective, on the other side of the park there, we have the St. Lawrence Eastern Lake Ontario Prism with Rob Williams. SLELO's rapid response team has successfully controlled 394 giant hogweed plants, 21 individual sites, protecting human health, with a potential to 65% eradication rate. SLEO representatives are collaborating with the New York Invasive Species Research Institute and SUNY ESF to release Hypena opulenta as a swallowwort biological control next month. Rob will be definitely interested in see how that goes this year. Also, Rob gave a note on the watercraft inspection steward program. The priority boat launches that are being manned by SLELO, basically they've had over probably by now 2,000 inspections with 403 AIS interceptions. Over to the Finger Lakes Prism with Haley Mosier. She also has 2 field crew members working to control giant hogweed, and they're working out of the Syracuse and Avon region. They are piloting a terrestrial survey program with 24 people, and they are in the 4th year of their macrophyte survey with 43 people, which was launched during NISA. Just a quick note, somebody's in the waiting room. If Carrie, if you could let them in, thank you. The New York NISA for the Finger Lakes, they had 21 events, which is phenomenal considering the COVID-19 restrictions. Hillary gave a really big push, and she did a nice job with that. Hillary also wanted you folks to know that she's released fact sheets for outreach for the Finger Lakes. I do have the attachment, I'm not gonna post it, but she's highlighted all the different boat launches across the Finger Lakes in terms of their latitude, longitude, location, parking lot size, unique features, any natural heritage elements, and of course on the back there's invasive species alerts for those specific regions. John Thompson's from the Catskill Prism did not get his report in yet. He is working on it. I will have updates to that. All right, on the back, maybe. All right. The Western New York Prism, Andrea Locke has been very busy. She has all of her 25 summer staff, including 18 of them for the boat steward program. There are 3 invasive species management assistants, 2 survey and monitoring technicians, 1 GIS technician, 1 education outreach assistant. She was quite busy getting her folks onboarded and up and running for the field season. Like most of us in the prism, we're trying to get people deemed essential and out and running through the door, quite difficult. The Western New York Prism Field Crew has completed invasive species surveys and removal projects over the past couple weeks. They've been working on slender false broom removal at Genesee County Park and Forest, along with a buckthorn removal at Fredonia College Lodge. The slender false broom project in Letchworth State Park is ongoing. To date, Andrea's Watercraft Steward Inspection Program, they've had 4,673 inspections that have interacted with over 10,000 people. Their acceptance rate is a little bit lower, down to 93%. This is probably due to COVID-19 and people just refusing an inspection to eliminate any of that contact possibility. They are currently staffing 19 different launches across the Western New York region. Hillary also had their spring partner meeting with 42 participants that included early detection and management updates. The Long Island Prism with Bill Jacobs, I did not get a report from him. I do know that they have been working on some of their prioritization projects with their ISPZs. Bill has also been taking rotational furloughs with his staff through their host, and that has contributed some of their programming, they're problematic with programming and stuff, but they are working on stuff. It's just at a different pace at the current COVID-19 conditions. Moving on to the capital region, we have been busy collaborating with survey projects and early detection. One of them in particular was with the New York State Office of Parks and Recreation and Historic Preservation. There is a 880-acre parcel that is owned by OSI that will be currently, it's in process of being transferred over to the park system. And it is kind of basically been earmarked for Cardinal blue butterfly habitat. Being part of the Moreau Lake State Park system, it is one of our ISPZs, and we have a vested interest in helping and collaborating with parks and documenting some of the current infestations there and the potential for future infestations. The property has basically been heavily logged. It's a nice shelterwood seed tree area that will be managed for lupine. The PRISM is also collaborating with the Wilton Wildlife Preserve to delineate hemlock stands for a citizen scientist monitoring project for the future. We have been busy in identifying infestations for future management with the Wilton Wildlife Preserve, and they are also one of the Cardinal blue butterfly habitats that is roughly about 20 miles from that parcel at Moreau. Recently, with some of the restrictions that have been lifted, we've been able to move forward with a lesser celandine project with the County of Albany. We have the soil and water, we have their stormwater, and then their conservation district are all in on this to help clean up some of the Anley Pond area in the Albany County. The Capital Region PRISM also hosted 2 virtual field trips. For ISAC, we had good turnout. They were tailored and specialized for the regional area of those locations. One was with the Saratoga Library, the other was with the Wilton Wildlife Preserve. We also have our boat steward program up and running. We are currently have employees at 20 sites. Our inspection numbers are up. We're close to 6,000 at this point. So during the COVID restrictions, there were more people going out on the boats. And so we've been quite busy, and we are still currently actively trying to get people permits lifted to get people at other sites. We have a lot of municipalities, canal corps, parks, and of course DEC launch sites. So that is our report from the PRISM. If there's any questions, feel free to give me a shout out now. If I have updates, I'll update that and send that to Renee. All right, Renee, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Anybody have any questions? Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Hopefully I didn't go too fast or too long. You guys are lucky.
Perfect. All right. So next on our agenda, I know our last meeting, we had talked about the National Invasive Species Council and National Advisory Committee. And, you know, we had done a draft letter regarding the National Advisory Committee. And just through talking with the National Council and everything, we didn't end up sending that letter to our council. But so this is kind of our presentation today is update on everything, and I'll pass it over to Carrie to introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Renee. And so yeah, this is a follow-up instead of the letter. Renee and I had a great talk with Jeff and with Sass from the National Invasive Species Council a couple weeks ago, and we're really grateful that they were willing to join us today so they could share some of the information that we were able to learn about when we talked with them. And I think it's really worthwhile for all of us to have this opportunity so we can think about the ways that we are going to or can support national efforts and interface with the National Invasive Species Council, particularly in light of the fact the ISAC at the national level is no longer in existence. And so what we're gonna do, you guys all got the agenda. We're going to let Sass and Jeff share with us for a little bit about what the National Invasive Species Council is doing and about their initiatives and how they plan to move forward without the ISAC at the moment. And then afterwards, we'll have 45 minutes or maybe a little less than that for half hour for discussion. And so, so we can, I don't know how they want to do it. I'll introduce them, they can get started. And then from there, if we want to save our discussion for the end, that might be the most efficient way to move forward, but I'll let them make that call. So what I've done is I've made both Jeff and Stas co-hosts, so you guys can share your screens if you have presentations. Stas Burgel is the executive director of the NISC. And in this capacity, he guides implementation of the policy-oriented actions set forth in the annual NISC work plan. And he provides advice on invasive species policy development to NISC member departments and agencies and participates in international negotiations focused on invasive species issues. Jeff Morissette is the chief scientist. I'm not sure how they're going to break this up. So I'm just going to introduce them both right now. And he coordinates a whole of government approach to addressing grand challenges in invasive species science and technology. And so thank you both so much. Do you want to start sharing your screen or are you just going to talk?
We were going to share our screen.
Okay.
And let's see, let me. See if this works. Okay, so is the screen up?
Yes.
Okay, great. So Carrie and Renee, thanks for that introduction, and I agree. Sort of the discussion that we had between you two and then the NISC staff a couple weeks back was, I think, sort of really interesting, and I'm glad that that's led to the opportunity to talk a little bit more broadly with the full New York Invasive Species Advisory Committee. I think one thing that I just want to state at the get-go is I think there's a lot of importance in terms of sort of state level work and a lot that I think can be learned from what's going on in the states as well as the potential for coordination across federal and state agencies in particular. I was talking recently with one of the principals, so that's one of the political level representatives from one of our member agencies, who was saying that, it's kind of neat that in the past, for like 5 years or so, there's been a tremendous growth in attention to invasive species issues. And I basically, I'd say, I think a lot of that really comes from the fact that states have picked up the game. They've gotten very engaged, that they're doing cutting edge work, whether that's Pacific Northwest on sort of mussel prevention or Hawaii on biosecurity or Eastern states on some forest issues. So I think truly states are sort of at a parity in terms of partners with federal agencies. So the opportunity to talk to folks, you guys within New York is, I consider that particularly valuable. So today what Jeff and I are going to do is basically tag team on the presentation. Let's see if I can get it to move. We'll start with just sort of an institutional context. Carrie mentioned a little bit about the Invasive Species Advisory Committee. So what have we been doing over the past sort of year or two? Then sort of practices and methods in terms of how we go about our work. And then, from sort of that more process type of focus, we'll get into the substantive work that we've been engaged in, both the priority activities that we have for the current year, as well as the process that we're looking at in terms of identifying priorities for 2021.
Stas, just to note, you see a really awesome picture of a sailboat, but I don't know if you're sharing slides yet.
Sorry, that's okay. So that is, thank you, Jeff.
Envious that maybe that's where we all want to be, but
it is sharing the wrong screen. So let me and try this. So hopefully that is not a sailboat. It's not telling me which screen I'm sharing. So do you see something that says overview?
Yes, there you go.
Okay, sorry about that. Problem sort of working with two screens and different technologies. Yeah, so the one other thing I was going to say is that largely, and you probably got an indication from the bios, Jeff covers sort of the science and the technical issues, and I cover more sort of the policy and law. So some of the discussion will also be broken down in that way as well. In terms of some of the background, given sort of the New York State process, sort of is very similar to the federal invasive species council, as well as when we did have a committee. I'm not going to spend too much time on just sort of the broader history, but basically the purpose of the council is to do high-level coordination across federal government agencies on invasive species issues. And that comes through the initial executive order 13112, which was signed in 1999, and then executive order 13751, which updated that in 2016. And so largely the 1999 one was really about sort of starting coordination, raising awareness, and you could think of the 2016 one as sort of an update and really thinking of how do we get better into implementation type of issues. The council, our council, is composed of 12 federal departments and 4 White House agencies. And the key thing in this, and I think it's relevant, with the 2016 executive order, that added 3 of the White House offices. So Council on Environmental Quality, Office of Management and Budget, and Office of Science and Technology Policy. Now, none of those 3 groups sort of has a regular invasive species program. However, given the cross-government role that they play in coordination, looking at budget issues, looking at environmental policy issues or science issues, I think they were a very sort of powerful addition to the council, and actually sort of have upped our ability to some extent in terms of now making sure that the White House and its sort of priority issues are also integrated into the work that the various departments are doing. So that's been sort of a critical set of actors that have been added to the sort of playing field over the last couple of years. We've recently gone through sort of a transition. I kind of think of 2019 as a transition year, and 2020 is when we're sort of now sort of moving into the implementation of the things that were developed in 2019. Basically, we were faced with capacity restraints, reduction in staffing, and so it was a process of streamlining, but in some sense also sort of operationalizing and codifying the rules and procedures by which the council operates. And so for the first time, we developed and got sort of cleared 8 terms of reference. The 2 executive orders in general spell out how the council operates, but it leaves a bit of room for interpretation. And so with codified terms of reference, that's really sort of helped both in terms of transparency as well as just people understanding the various roles. And with an organization like this, you get people coming in both at the programmatic level as well as sort of the political level, on a coming in, going out on a regular basis. So the ability to sort of provide them with this type of terms of reference has been very valuable, just in terms of understanding what the baseline is. The other thing that we did was we moved from a 3-year management plan to a 1-year work plan. And our previous 3 management plans had all sort of varied a little bit in terms of numbers of priorities, from upwards of 80 or 90 priorities. Then the third one had probably 30 to 40. Different notions in terms of responsibility for the work. Is it individual agencies? Is it interagency groups? At times, was it our advisory committee or the NISC staff? And so moving to a 1-year work plan has, I think, streamlined our work in a couple areas. First, for all of our priority activities, we have an interagency team. So there's consistency in terms of how we're working on the various issues. Also, we've reduced the number of priorities to, in this case, for 2020, to 6 priorities. And so that really lets us say, okay, on sort of one hand plus one digit, these are the priorities that the federal government through the council is working on, as opposed to trying to pick and choose across 30 plus activities. And also, it allows us to be a bit more nimble in terms of taking on issues that the administration or various departments see as priorities. I think with the 3-year work plans, which also had a tendency to spread into subsequent years, some administrations felt that they were sort of trapped by what came before them, or circumstances had changed over the course of 2 to 3 years, but there was little ability for sort of adaptation or change within the management plan itself. So by moving to a 1-year work plan, we have a bit more flexibility in terms of working on immediate priorities in a manner that involves all of the agencies that are relevant within the NISC family. A couple other issues, and I'll go through in a little more detail in the following slides. There was definitely a focus in terms of how we work with other interagency committees, for example, the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, how we go about stakeholder engagement. And I'll get to a little bit more on sort of the role that ISAC had played, as well as what we're doing in the interim. So let me move on to the next slide. With the terms of reference, one of the things that we did was to solidify basically how the council is represented. And so we have, the executive order talks about the secretaries of the departments and agencies. But on a practical basis, that doesn't sort of usually happen. So we have 2 levels of representation. The first level are principals, and those are usually sort of politically appointed, sort of high-level folks within the departments that sort of are appointed by the secretary. So for example, with the Department of the Interior, we have the acting assistant secretary, Scott Cameron. With USDA, these are the 3 co-chairs. With USDA, we have Undersecretary Greg Eibach. And then we have a new sort of person coming in with NOAA, who's yet to be identified, I think. So they sort of serve at a fairly high political level and can represent their departments or agencies in discussions with us. On a sort of day-to-day level of interaction, we have senior advisors for each of those agencies. They participate in monthly meetings. We have sort of routine sort of bulletins and other information that goes out to them. Just for reference, Hillary Smith, who is the Department of Interior senior advisor to the council, came out of New York, sort of working with TNC and the prisms there. So there's a good connection. And then finally, there's the council staff itself. And in the executive order, it wasn't really defined in terms of the role that the staff plays in terms of administering the work of the council. So within the terms of reference that I mentioned previously, it goes into quite a bit of detail in terms of how the staff goes about its job, how the staff works with the senior advisors and the principals on a fairly sort of detailed level. And then finally, there's sort of coordination with interagency committees. The terms of reference also set out, as I mentioned, so the development of how we develop our annual work plans. And that includes 2 different sections. One are thematic priority activities. I already sort of talked about sort of moving, reducing the number down to sort of 6, and we'll get into those in sort of the second half of the presentation. But it also outlines a number of general coordination responsibilities in terms of convening regular meetings, providing updates, coordinating interagency task teams, facilitating information. So, sort of the coordination responsibilities that you might expect from a secretariat type of body. Then for the thematic priorities, the question is, how do they get identified? And first and foremost, they have to be put forward by a NISC member agency as a priority, that there needs to be commitment from 2 or more agencies in terms of engaging in them, such that there is that interagency dynamic and it doesn't just fall within the authority or jurisdiction of a single agency. Alignment with agency goals. that there is a beneficial role that NISC staff can play in terms of this coordination, and that generally there are sort of these types of activities are useful, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. So just sort of smart implementation. I've talked a bit about the interagency committees, and what we've tried to do sort of over the past probably year or two is improve the coordination across them. Certainly there has been interaction between, say, NISC and the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, or with the Federal Interagency Committee for Management of Noxious and Exotic Weeds, FICMANU. But that was more sort of ad hoc and haphazard. And so in going through the development of the terms of reference, one of the things that some of the federal agencies were saying was like, you know, look, we participate on all these different interagency committees. We kind of need them to be talking to each other because everybody has capacity constraints, time constraints. So to the extent that there might be the ability to sort of match up work across strategic plans or to share information that's being developed or that's being solicited, how can we just improve the coordination on that level? And so we've worked with the 5 other sort of main interagency groups working on invasive species. So I mentioned ANSTF as well as FICMANU. There's also a federal committee that works on invasive terrestrial animals and pathogens, one that works on biological control of weeds, and then finally integrated pest management. And there's certainly overlap in terms of agencies and sometimes technical folks as well. And then some differences in terms of how they sort of reach out to various stakeholder groups or not. Some of these are federal only, some of these have sort of means to engage states or others in them as well. So that's been sort of another area that we've sort of stepped into over the past year or two, is making sure that these groups are sort of talking to each other and that sort of having an understanding of the processes, strategic plans, and things like that. And then on stakeholder engagement. So last year, at the beginning of the year, our advisory committee was put into a administratively inactive status, given sort of capacity and funding reasons. And then not too long after that, the White House put out an executive order calling for departments to basically review the FACA committees that they have, and then, you know, where they are not sort of active or useful, to sort of reduce those. And so unfortunately, the Invasive Species Advisory Committee, given that it had recently been put on an active status, was sort of low-hanging fruit for that process. And so the charter was not renewed, and basically sort of ISAC continues to be in an inactive status. Recognizing that fact, the principals still felt that engagement with non-federal stakeholders was important, and encouraged us to look at other means to do that. And so one of the things we've been doing is to develop a stakeholder engagement strategy, and sort of targeted on 4 areas. One, with regard to the work plan priorities, where and how can we involve non-federal groups? Look at mechanisms for ongoing input, regular meetings, National Invasive Species Awareness Week, those kinds of opportunities. Third is targeted stakeholder engagement. So where we recognize that there's a sort of particular constituency or interest group that's relevant with political priorities, figuring out how to engage with them. And then finally, just basic outreach materials and information resources. I think as we're going, so right now we've basically have a final draft of this, and we're waiting for a meeting of the NIST co-chairs. So those are the principals from Interior, Agriculture, and Commerce to sign off on this. And when it's signed off, we'll basically have a version that's available on our website and that's public. I think the one thing that we didn't expect, and nobody probably expected, was with COVID. And so a lot of the outreach that we were hoping to do in terms of attending various meetings, Ecological Society of America, the NASMA conference, things like that, seeing people at NISA, hasn't come to bear. And so we've been sort of scrambling a little bit to think about, okay, well, what do we do in a COVID-19 era? And so we certainly appreciate the opportunity to talk to the New York Invasive Species Advisory Committee. So we're adapting with that, as is everyone, and sort of we'll see what happens as sort of time moves on and our opportunities develop and evolve. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to Jeff, who's going to talk a little bit about sort of the method and process that we use, and then he's going to start in on our work plan and the priority activities with a kind of a deeper dive on eDNA, and we'll sort of proceed from there to talk a little bit, address some of the other priorities as well. So Jeff, do you want to take the mic?
Sure. Just to check on sound, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Okay, well, and I'll echo Stash's appreciation, as he mentioned, with our advisory committee being administratively inactive and then disbanded. The opportunities to work with Gary and this New York ISAC is really us kind of coming up with that workaround. So we really appreciate the invitation to be here and talk to you all. Again, I think I talked to the New York group, but maybe it was a PRISM coordinating group, and I was at the NASMA conference last year up in Saratoga Springs, so I met some folks there. Really appreciate the tenacity. You know, we're coming up with these workarounds and staying in touch, so just an appreciation for that. So as Stash suggested or mentioned, that I was going to talk about a little bit on the side of what we do with research and technology. This slide actually I used, it's borrowed from David Lodge, some of the graphics at the NASMA conference last year, North American Invasive Species Management Association. And I think it does a good job kind of laying out the components, whereas research is supposed to inform management. Are there advisory boards on a management side, or is there some way for management to then inform the research team? And there's bridging organizations that help make those connections and kind of cycle through that process there, where policy management in the middle motivates the research or knowledge innovation. And then that research informs, hopefully, policy or management actions. I tend to use the term bridging organization fairly loosely. I think there's some literature that has that specific or tries to kind of say yes or no if something is a bridging organization. So in some ways, the National Invasive Species Council and what we do is a bridging organization. In some ways, maybe what the advisory committee is doing there is helping to bridge, and maybe the PRISMs or people in those PRISMs are doing some of that bridging. Another term that I've heard used is boundary organizations, and then I've heard boundary chains. So there's more than one organization that's doing that connecting between the research and the applied management side. But the next slide, I think Sasha's going to advance through them because he's got that. We'll just stick with his presentation. Shows kind of this cycle again. If you can click again, I think there's an animation that shows what I think is kind of a government, not just federal, but maybe the state level, and what the ISAC in New York, as well as what the National Invasive Species Council can do, is help to iterate and evolve through that cycle through time. You know, a given researcher might have a 2-year project, a manager may come and go. So, you know, there's this opportunity, I think, from that kind of longer term federal or state government investment to march that on forward through time. And I'll kind of allude to this or kind of go back to this graphic and this concept when I talk about the eDNA work. But next slide shows kind of this Venn diagram of science, policy, and management, whereas NISC is trying to convene, bring people together, coordinate, make sure there's a connection, leverage if there's something at some agency that is going to be helpful for another agency, which that agency may be unaware of. You know, make sure there's awareness and try to reuse a given science, a piece of science that can be informative, or lessons learned from some management, and then trying to amplify and let folks know about the work that's happening across that. So we see that as kind of doing all those, convening, coordinating, leveraging, and amplifying across that science, policy, and management. And it's interesting with all those agencies that Sash had shown. Some agencies do both science, policy, and management, and that's principally the co-chairs of Department of Interior, USDA, and Department of Commerce through NOAA really have a foot in each of those circles. Some other agencies, we work with NASA, for example, is more in the science domain. And so that coordination can be helpful to bring the policy and management to an agency that's more in that science domain, or if there's an agency that's a little bit more in the policy or management, making sure they're aware of some science that might be happening outside of their agency. The next slide, we'll get into some specific examples of what we've done. We've co-edited or edited, guest editing with some special issues. And 2 were done in the Entomological Society of America, 1 on advanced genetics for invasive arthropods, and then 1 on geospatial analysis. And then there was also a special issue, biological invasion. Jamie Reeser was leading that, but Sasha and I were involved and contributed to that, and quite a few folks across the invasion biology area who contributed to that, and that was on early detection and rapid response, with quite a bit on early detection. And those have come out recently. And I thought those have been a good way to kind of tie a ribbon around a package of work that does pertain to invasive species and bring some of the science of invasion biology kind of out in a way that can be shared quite broadly. The next, in addition to special issues, the next slide shows some of the work we've done with prize challenges. We were not involved much with the Great Lakes Invasive Carp Challenge, and maybe some of the folks on the line were aware of it. It was run primarily out of Michigan, which is maybe why the logo kind of cuts off Lake Ontario and some of New York there. But that set a good, I thought that was a well-run challenge. I thought it had some interesting results, and it was sort of exemplary. And that was just as we were getting into this sort of tracking what challenges we're doing. We then helped co-host with Department of Interior and the National Park Service, the OHIA challenge. This is a rapid OHIA death that's causing mortality in the OHIA tree in Hawaii. And then more recently, we did a white nose syndrome challenge, kind of contributed to that on Oregon with the Fish and Wildlife Service. They ran that, but we were on the advisory board and helped with the review of that. And then more recently, not specifically related to invasives, but NASA has a Space Apps Challenge. We helped out with and we'll be helping with the judging of their COVID challenge on environmental factors, trying to see where maybe that invasion biology, some of the work that's been done in environmental factors and spread modeling of vectors could help kind of evaluate what some of the suggestions are coming up from there. And there will be a Space Apps Challenge. The typical schedule for NASA Space Apps Challenges is in the fall, so I think in September, and there will be on the regular schedule of Space Apps, and there will be some invasion biology being part of that challenge. So that's maybe something to stay tuned for. Maybe then we'll move on to the thematic priority activities. That's kind of a whirlwind tour of our science and innovation portfolio, but now moving on to those priority thematic activities that Stosh had mentioned, and this is in the 2021 work plan. Two relate to rapid response. One is lessons learned or agency tools to do rapid response, and then the other is related to emergency funding. We'll have a slide for each of these to go into more detail, but just going through the list, environmental DNA, invasive species and fire, and then advanced biotech, and then revisiting the lower right there being the crosscut budget. NISC had done that for quite a few years, was put on hiatus as we iterated through that transition from the previous management plan to the new one. The principals and the senior advisors that Stosh had mentioned you kind of said that was useful and asked that be put back in to a priority activity, and we've got that. And I think it is a very helpful way. I would just suggest to folks to point to the significant amount of resources the U.S. government is putting into invasive species. So folks are probably familiar with the Pimentel estimates of the economic costs back in the early 2000s. This provides, I think, a cross-cut budget, but kind of an up-to-date, at least, document of what federal agencies are spending. So now I was going to go into a little bit on the environmental DNA and kind of describing how we do that kind of iteration through knowledge invention, policy management, and making it relevant to New York. Great Lakes is exemplary, mainly with the carp and the Asian carp, and keeping them out of the Great Lakes. And a lot of the work in monitoring at this point really relies on environmental DNA. And then the rest of this is kind of an outline of what I'll talk about. So maybe just the next slide, and folks are probably aware of this Great Lakes Asian carp monitoring. Maybe click again. Gosh, there's an animation here to show the quality assurance program. There's a story map that does a nice job animating through where occurrences have been found. And the next slide shows, or next click, shows this quality assessment project plan. And I think by moving to this fully documented project plan, again, it's exemplary, not in just the use of eDNA, but how to use it carefully and how to make sure the results are appropriately interpreted by management. We could go into more detail about eDNA and that kind of what does a positive and negative mean from an eDNA analysis. It's kind of an interesting topic for sure, but suffice it to say, I think that this is a great example of where that cycle has been gone through with the research, understanding what eDNA tells you, and then moving into an operational use of that technology. The next slide, if you could, kind of then shows how this is maybe even being expanded out at a national level with what NOAA, one of the co-chair principles through Commerce, is with NISC, is to have this omics strategy. And maybe it suffices to point out, or it's interesting to point out goal 2. I have one more slide on that, but that it's expanding partnerships. So to the extent that anyone there in New York is using genomics or advanced genomics research and is connected with USDA, you have this hook to bring to proposals or future work or collaboration with NOAA to to kind of point to as justifying or kind of amplifying your work that might be related to that. But the next slide shows in particular where invasive species are in that. So it's objective 2.1. Again, just calling this out. So if you're partnering with anybody at NOAA, you can kind of point to the strategy as a priority, as an objective, and maybe you are indeed living into that with some of your work. The next slide kind of backs up to the next 2 slides, talk about kind of this is pretty established literature as guidance for the environmental DNA community, published back in 2016. So it's been 4 years or so, kind of walking through the technical side of eDNA. Next slide shows a more recent publication. I'm not sure if it's even out yet, but just in press. This is Adam Sepulveda leading this with USGS, and definitely has a Western slant with respect to the mussels in the Pacific Northwest, but it starts to get at more than just the technical implementation, but how do we make sure management is ready to utilize this and interact with management so they use it in a way that's proper and don't kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, or properly don't rush the gun on if there is a positive, making sure that it clearly might represent a viable population before you dig too much into it. The next slide, I think, then just sort of says where we are with that environmental DNA priority action plan or item is sort of articulating this guidance. This is preliminary. This is what we're working through. What I think hasn't been stated much. We're not finding it much in literature. I'm not seeing a lot out there with white papers or government documents. Is when it's best to use environmental DNA, and there's a bit of technical resources and capacity to initiate to use eDNA. When is it good to use it? And then if you do, what are the type of considerations you should have? Operational plans, communication plans, that's with managers and others, and then kind of what do you do with the results that come from eDNA? So I think where most of the literature is kind of in that yellow band currently. Adam Sepulveda's paper starts to get in this green, the utilizing the results. But what we're hoping to come up with is a paper that will kind of go into all three of these components of environmental DNA. I think with that, I'm handing, oh no, one more from me, and then I'll hand it back, or Stosh will go over on the other ones that he's leading. So I'm leading, we're dividing and conquering. I'm leading the eDNA and the wildland fire. With the wildland fire, this is in collaboration with Wildland Fire Leadership Council. Probably less relevant to the New York area, but you know, there is something that certainly, especially with some of the warming and trends we're seeing, you know, might be relevant. And it's focusing on the out west and invasive grasses and how that's contributing to wildland fire. Now showing that grasses and grasslands are burning at the rate, as far as acreage, of forested lands, and so trying to understand where that where the invasive species intersect with wildland fire, and then trying to coordinate suitably across the management or federal and state actions related to wildland fire and invasive species. So trying to identify some priority management and policy responses from that. And probably just roughly breaking that down into kind of fuel treatment is a big deal, post-fire restoration, data sharing, and then you know, research and development. So those are kind of some themes that are emerging from that. But with that, I'll pass it back. Stosh, I think you're going to talk about the next priority actions with respect to rapid response.
Great, thank you, Jeff. And can folks hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Just want to make sure I was successfully off mute. So Jeff went over the first sort of two of the priority activities, environmental DNA, as well as wildland fire and invasive species, and I'll sort of quickly go through the other four. As Jeff mentioned, two of those are related to rapid response. And with the previous management plan, there was a major focus on early detection, rapid response, sort of writ large, which a lot of that culminated in the special issue of biological invasions. But when we went back and looked at that, or sort of while we were in the process of working on it, we recognized that it was a bit slanted towards the early detection side of things and not so much the rapid response. And so in thinking about the FY 2020 work plan, we sort of included two kind of follow-on priorities. The first is really looking at agency roles and thinking about federal agencies. And so right now what we're doing, and this is sort of going into their relevant authorities, sort of dividing it up across where there are emergency authorities. For example, if it's a new plant pest, what authorities does USDA have to act on that? Land, water, asset management authorities. So if you've got Forest Service or Fish and Wildlife Service or Park Service, what are the types of things that they can do from a rapid response perspective? And then finally, recognizing that in a number of cases, rapid response efforts might be led at a state level or minimally involve state, tribal, local governments. And so what are the types of supporting or partnering activities that agencies can take? So at the end of this, what we're hoping to have, one of the products will sort of be a matrix that would look at the different agencies across these different areas to understand sort of what authorities they have in the rapid response sector. And in terms of thinking, well, what does that actually mean when we say rapid response sector? It's also sort of going through the various sort of stages of rapid response and the steps within each of those stages. So here I've noticed there's the focus on the various roles of federal agencies across the three categories that I explained, and then cross-referencing that with various sort of stages in rapid response. So the assessment stage, the deployment of the rapid response framework and the actual treatment, then post-treatment, also recognizing that there are a number of activity areas that are ongoing throughout this in terms of provision of resources, thinking about environmental compliance and regulatory issues, communications and outreach, and then information systems and data management. So at the end of the day, we hope to have a piece that really sort of clarifies those federal agency roles. And I think the value of that is sort of twofold in terms of really being clear in terms of where there's coverage and where there's gaps from a federal perspective, but also allowing sort of a clearer perspective in terms of when working with non-federal actors, whether that's states, tribes, whoever it might be, what is the nexus and what roles might they be playing? And so it's really just trying to sort of clarify where there are cooperative opportunities. The second rapid response area is looking at an emergency fund. And this is something, it's a concept that has been recommended in a number of places at a number of times, at a number of scales, whether it's at a state level, whether it's at a federal level, within the context of NISC or within the context of the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force. It seems to be a concept that keeps coming up. However, it's also kind of a, I don't want to say a political hot potato, but it's a sensitive issue in terms of when you start talking about a fund, you start talking about resources, and at that point, people get nervous because it's just tough to talk about federal budgets and sort of putting the cart before the horse in that sense. However, given the interest in the idea of a fund and that it seems to keep coming up, we are taking sort of the first baby step, and that's sort of going in and looking at other models and experiences from other sectors where they have various types of emergency funds, and then taking that into an invasive species context to really sort of outline the types of criteria or considerations that would have to be considered should a fund be developed. And so, in this process, we're not making any sort of promises or commitments in terms of the provision of resources for a fund, but we're really sort of doing the intellectual exercise on what a fund could look like or the questions that it might consider. And so the rationale behind that is presuming that some point down the line, whether it's an agency, Congress, or somebody else says, okay, we need this, we're going to sort of put it into law or whatever it might be, that we've already done some of the thinking along the lines of what might need to go into that. And so it's, while it is an intellectual exercise, we do think it has value down the line, whether that's at a federal level, a state level, whatever it might be. Another area where we had done some work in the past, and the 20 work plan is helping sort of crystallize that, is in the area of advanced biotechnology applications for invasive species. So you've probably heard about CRISPR-Cas9, gene drives, RNA interference, and sort of a whole range of new sort of biotech tools, many of which can be applied to invasive species control. And this is a field that's evolving fast. It's a field that evolves not just sort of the technical part, but how does that factor into land management considerations or into policy considerations. And many of the federal agencies within the NISC family are looking at different parts of that. And so from the agencies, we understood that there was an interest in terms of having a mechanism where federal agencies could discuss these issues. So we've set up a federal community of practice. And so we meet sort of every other month or so and sort of try to do a sort of a deep dive in terms of what various agencies are doing on particular topics, or what are the key questions that seem to be arising that need to be addressed. And so some of those areas have included the actual applications. So what are the specific technologies, the species, how are they being developed, who's developing them? We recently had one looking at risk. So that's thinking about risk assessment methods. How do you sort of think about containment if you're doing sort of research or lab trials or field trials. And then also the regulatory intersections with applications that are going through, whether it's FDA, APHIS, or EPA. Policy is another area. There's the coordinated framework, which at a very broad level helps to facilitate communications across the three primary regulatory agencies that I just mentioned. But then each of those regulatory agencies has their own implementing regulations. There's international considerations. There's also considerations from endangered species perspective, NEPA perspective. So there's that whole policy landscape to be explored at a federal level, not to mention how are states going to engage in these types of questions as well. So there'll certainly be an intersection there. And then finally, really sort of the outreach and engagement part. Within sort of regulatory application processes, there's the opportunity for public comment, but I think people recognize that that is in no way sufficient in terms of the questions that these applications may bring to conservation issues. So beyond sort of the processes that are already in law, what are the other types of engagement and outreach that is we need to be considering from a federal perspective? And then within all this, we recognize that some of the federal agencies have their own individual projects, and so we just try to sort of bring expertise and resources from other agencies to assist them. And then the last area, which Jeff already talked a little bit about, is the cross-cut budget. It had been sort of put on hiatus for about 2 years, and with the one that we're currently finalizing, we hope to fill some of those gaps, and this is certainly useful in terms of understanding sort of status and trends in funding over time. We'd hope to have it sort of published last week. We've got sort of a couple agencies going through their final clearance process, so we hope to have it out, if not this week, then in the very near future. So that kind of outlines the work plan activities that we have for the fiscal year 2020. Ideally, we'll have sort of products coming up through the approval processes in late summer and sort of hitting sort of the airwaves, so to speak, in sort of September. We'll see how that goes. Obviously, agencies are also pressed for time in terms of responding to COVID, and technical folks and the folks that we work with have their own constraints in terms of teleworking and things like that. But we're as much as possible trying to stick with the timeline that sort of goes with this fiscal year. And at the same time, we're recognizing that when moving into fiscal year 21, we sort of need to have an idea of what we're working on. So we've initiated the process. I think it'll be streamlined to the extent that we're going to use the 20 work plan as a model. We've already started engaging the agencies and the NISC principals in terms of reviewing their experiences to date with activities under the 20 work plan, and that's both our general sort of coordination responsibilities as well as the priority activities. And we'll largely draw from sort of 3 sort of different areas for considering what the priority activities for 21 will be. So certainly some of the FY20 work plan areas will have recommendations or follow-on activities, and we'll look at those to see, okay, what are appropriate for individual agencies, what might rise to the level for continued action by the council. Then in the development of the fiscal year 20 work plan, there were a number of items that didn't make the cut, some of which agencies would sort of like to put back in the mix. So we'll be sort of going back to look at what wasn't sort of picked up in 2020 that might be of interest. And then finally being sort of open to new ideas, suggestions, as well as priorities that have emerged over the past year. So, and some people have sort of suggested some of the health related aspects, modeling aspects of the intersection of invasive species, One Health, COVID-19, obviously that's a hot topic as well. And within that, so we'll certainly try to consider the interest and means of input from non-federal stakeholders. The timeline for all of this is hopefully, again, to have something by September 2020. And again, we'll just sort of go with the process in terms of working with our NISC agencies under sort of the current constraints that we have with COVID. So I think that is it for our presentation. Certainly thanks for taking the time to listen to it. I know it's sort of slightly long-winded, but hopefully this gives you sort of a soup to nuts idea of where we've sort of been over the past couple of years and where we're headed in the near future. And this is the NISC staff, and I think now Carrie and Renee, we can sort of open it up to discussion. I'm curious for any questions or suggestions or comments you all might have.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. That was really, really interesting. We do have some questions coming into the chat box that if I'm happy to read, or if whoever put them in there would like to read them. Meredith, you had a question if you want to go ahead and ask. Oh, I'm not sure if you're muted, Meredith, or maybe stepped away. So Meredith's question is the emergency fund research going to be available for state, local governments someplace?
Okay, so the idea with sort of all of the work plan priorities, which are developing sort of products, so to speak, is that at the end of the day, they will be sort of cleared, adopted by NISC, and made to be public documents. So both of the rapid response areas that I mentioned, at the end of the day, those will be publicly available. Obviously, as we sort of go through that process, we are collecting a lot of information, sort of doing background research. We also sort of paired up with the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force to do outreach on some broader EDR issues to the ANSTF regional panels and members. And just for reference, we got a very good sort of response back from DEC in New York on particularly some of the incident command system work that New York does. But all of the, so the public, the final clear documents will be made available. And then certainly the research that has gone into it, we can make available as well if sort of folks have follow-up questions or can benefit from that kind of background information.
Okay, great. And so George, are you on? Do you want to go ahead and?
Well, yeah, just to give a little context, in many states, there are huge, amounts of federal property, and the state agencies that you work with are, very well embedded with state governments in those situations. In New York, it's very different. I was wondering how places like New York, how our priorities get heard at your table? How does New York's needs and the whole Northeast, the regional needs, work their way into your, your 6 priorities, for example?
Right. Great question. And I think, some of that is addressed with the engagement strategy, although that really doesn't go into the details. Some of it's also, I don't want to say sort of the squeaky wheel gets the grease, but we have been, I think, to the best of our ability, trying to identify sort of where there are sort of active and ongoing groups that want to engage. So one example, the Western Governors Association, they recently set up a Western Invasive Species Council. It's a perfect convening point for us to be able to work with a lot of the invasive species folks in Western states and sort of the priorities that they're sort of bringing to bear. Certainly in some of the other sort of high profile sort of regional issues, whether it's the Columbia River Basin, the Great Lakes and carp, those are issues that are sort of floating up both through the agencies that work on the ground, as well as sort of the, some of the broader communications and folks coming in and talking with the council as well as the principals. Another area where we've been sort of paying a lot of attention is with sort of the regional invasive species council groups. So there's RISC in the Northeast. There's another group that's looking at those issues in the Northwest, as well as in Hawaii. And again, sort of looking at them as sort of the places where this input is sort of being sort of consolidated at a regional level. And so, to some extent, it's just opportunistic. I won't pretend to say that we have a perfect or comprehensive plan in place, but we are trying to use the connections that we have, whether it's with the folks in New York State or Florida or wherever, just to get a sense of what's going on. And just by example, last week, Washington State had their Invasive Species Council meeting. We sort of sat in to see what are the priorities that they're looking at. And so we try to have that as sort of keep an open mind in terms of those areas of engagement. And certainly when folks sort of step forward and sort of ask us for input or to provide a presentation, we're more than happy to do that. It's sort of certainly constrained by what our capacity is, but we're doing the best of our ability to cast a wide net. And I certainly sort of take, if you have sort of other suggestions, we can certainly take those into account as well.
Well, thank you. It really comes down to resources and spending. And you know, New York covers an awful lot of its own invasive species management and to some extent research spending from its own budget. I don't see how the federal money is flowing. It certainly flows into some of our prisms through the Great Lakes initiatives and things like that. But I was just wondering if there's any kind of an overview, or is everything kind of just ad hoc?
I'd say it's certainly been ad hoc. I know that when we talk with through the agencies, the NISC members, a lot of them have sort of their priority issues and regions. I've mentioned sort of Pacific Northwest and mussels, and certainly now sort of fire and grasslands. Overall, the administration certainly has a Western sort of, I don't want to say bias, maybe it's a bias. But you know, I think we're conscious of that, and in terms of Jeff and I, and trying to see where are there opportunities to sort of get a sense of what's happening in sort of the Southeast or the Northeast, and try to make sure that when we have discussions about the next work plan, you know, where can we sort of integrate those types of issues. And I should also say that I think one of the things that we can do a better job on, and we've just sort of done the first round on development of 20 work plan, is figuring sort of ahead of time what types of activities really would be sort of a state-federal collaboration within the work plan. This past time, the work plan, the priorities were developed, and then on top of that, we were trying to overlay our engagement priorities. I'm hoping that this time we can sort of think about some of the engagement a bit in advance prior to defining what the activities are going to be.
Yeah, thank you.
Not a perfect system, but I think we're trying to do the best that we can.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions in the chat box, so I might just take the liberty to go ahead and ask a question. So I know this is something that we've talked about before, Stas and Jeff, about this, how it's easier when a region kind of coordinates like among themselves and then communicates with you. So it's not, 50 states trying to interact on different priorities. And here in New York, we really have been trying to gain momentum to some sort of a Northeast Invasive Species Council. It hasn't, even though we've been in conversations with the governor's office and our Invasive Species Council, we haven't been able to bring that up to a high enough priority to make it happen yet. And so I just didn't know, as you're thinking about this, how you've been able to interact with the Western states and their Invasive Species Council, and that's really facilitated your collaborations with them. What recommendations would you have for us as a state to try to initiate that Northeast unity to form a council or some sort of advisory board or something that could interact with you guys on our issues? I don't know if you have anything in the works for that.
Right. I mean, I don't think part of that sort of as you noted, sort of a state level, and I think sort of state priority setting. In thinking about the work in Western states, the Western Governors Association, probably at a programmatic level, had sort of been, I don't want to say sort of limping along, but it had been sort of going sort of issue by issue on sort of various invasive species issues. And it was, I think, only when the chair of that group, Governor Ige from Hawaii, sort of said, our priority for my 2-year term is going to be biosecurity and invasive species, that sort of really helped. It was sort of the coalescing moment. And out of that sort of grew their Western Invasive Species Council. And I think, leading up to that, there was a lot of interest at a programmatic level, but there wasn't that sort of the political will, so to speak. And my understanding is sort of in the East, you don't have that same type of governors association. So I think, at the end of the day, one of the questions is, is there an entity that can speak at that level, whether it's formal or informal? And it's really just, sort of the biosecurity initiative from WGA is sort of it's over and done. There are a series of recommendations, but its legacy, one of its legacies was the Western Invasive Species Council. So what is the kind of thing that can sort of, be that amplifying moment, get something on paper, and then ideally that just sort of provides sort of a mechanism to engage and move forward. So I think part of the question for me would be, is there sort of any kind of entity that just, even if it's just for a year, sort of puts that out on the map and allows for that kind of high profile engagement. And I know that from the folks that I work with at the principals level, particularly USDA and Interior, if states are knocking at the door and sort of wanting to have meetings, whether governor or governor's staff, whoever it might be, they're very responsive. And so I think it's understanding that within the federal government, at a fairly high level, there's certainly receptivity to states coming in and saying that these are priorities, and we can help facilitate those discussions on our side. But I think on the state side, particularly if it's sort of a regional engagement, there has to be some sort of a coalescing factor.
I would just maybe add to that two points. One, those other interagency groups, and I noticed in the chat that someone's involved with ANSTF, that we really do try to listen, and NISC and our 3-person staff that you see there, try to partner with those 5 interagency groups. So if it's a priority bubbling up through the Great Lakes or the Northeast regional panels of ANSTF, that I think would help us. So take advantage of those existing works and as far as the weed, thick manure as well. That kind of, we can kind of partner and work with them. The other strategy might be, you got the Western Governors Association at that kind of political level, organizing across a region at the political level. There's maybe another consideration is more organizing at the taxa or ecosystem level. So you've got Great Lakes and you've got the mussels and the carp and other work through Great Lakes work. I think that could resonate with our co-chairs or the principals. And so again, let me just, I guess I'd back up to Sasha's point saying, how we develop this work plan is that we take the guidance or lead from those our member agencies and those 5 interagency groups. So we're just trying to amplify and work to do kind of what we're hearing from them. So from an ecosystem or a taxon type of approach, you could see where Great Lakes is going to be important to NOAA and DOI and USDA, maybe DOI and NOAA more than USDA. Whereas, if you're looking at forest pests and you guys want to work more or coordinate with some federal activities with that, with state and private forestry, which is maybe more relevant in New York than it is out west, or the USDA APHIS. Those are maybe some hooks where you get that kind of general taxon work that's being done there, and then it boils up to where NISC would focus on when there's more than one agency involved and where some coordination across those agencies would be beneficial. So that's one slice of all the work that you might, you maybe state and private forestry is enough for you all to really kind of get some resources and coordination with them. And if there's no other agencies being involved, NISC would probably not need to contribute or have much in area to contribute. But if there's interagency coordination on those issues, I think we could step in. So that's just maybe kind of some other food for thought with respect to that coordination and trying to take advantage and coordinate some of those resources.
Thanks so much. So Meg, I think we already touched on that, but if you had anything else you wanted to add, anyone who wants to just add in on these, it doesn't necessarily have to be formally done in the chat box. You can go ahead and unmute yourself and contribute. Are there any other questions or thoughts or ideas?
I think the next up, just to, excuse me. This is George. We Stash referred to, I believe, that Pimentel study, which, set some kind of a dollar value on the cost of invasive species. Everybody quotes that. It goes way back. It's pretty old, but it's still pretty sturdy. But that was essentially a one-semester graduate course. That's where that came from. A bunch of bright students just gathered data and slapped it into a paper. It was useful, but I was wondering if you think there's value and interest in going back and revisiting that and getting some sturdier numbers and more up-to-date numbers.
Yeah, I think they're yes to both the value and the interest. I think where there have been difficulties is sort of moving on to the next step. It's one issue that the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force has talked about a number of times, just from the aquatic side and how would you go about it. And I sort of know a little bit about that, but I'm not sort of more knowledge about sort of the path and the details that they've taken. And then for a while there was the within USDA, the Economic Research Service was doing sort of bits and pieces. I wouldn't say anything comprehensive, but they've also sort of suffered a bit of attrition with their recent move of their staff to the Midwest. And so I think, and it's an issue that sort of comes up roundly, sort of every sort of year or two, about the need for that. And maybe that's, sort of one of the things that just sort of conceptually in terms of need is sort of worth putting on the table in terms of discussions, whether it's with NISC or NISC with other partner organizations, academics or otherwise. So I think, yes, interest and need, but sort of where we've been stymied a little bit is the next steps in terms of how you actually get something like that started.
Thanks.
Meg, did you have something you wanted to say?
No, I think I just wanted to second what Jeff was saying, that I feel like the invasive species topic at the Northeastern Governors Association group is not very strong. And if there was an opportunity to support that, that would be great.
So Carrie, two things I was going to say. One, and I don't sort of not entirely familiar in terms of sort of the outputs of the New York Advisory Species Advisory Committee and reports to New York Invasive Species Council. However, if those are public documents, just that basic kind of information is useful for us to sort of keep our finger on the pulse, and sort of understanding what are the issues that are coming up in the East, because we have to get our information from somewhere. And so that might be sort of one useful source. The other thing, I think in the chat, somebody asked about where's the documentation for a lot of the things that we talked about, like the terms of reference and the work plan. That is on our website, invasivespecies.gov. I think they're under guidance documents, but I can also provide you with the direct links, Carrie, and maybe you can distribute that to the group so that folks have a direct link to those documents as well.
Great, yeah. I was thinking, as you were talking about the eDNA initiative, for example, here in New York, the DEC has also taken on eDNA as a priority and recently hired, within the last year or two, hired a person full-time to work on eDNA issues. And I'm not sure, Jeff, have you interacted with them? And if you haven't, what would the path be to kind of line up priorities or work together or take advantage of resources? I'm just trying to think of how, when a state has a program that fits within one of your priorities, how we could work together and, kind of move things forward, kind of aligned with what's going on at the federal level.
Yeah, I would love to have the contact information, Carrie, if you want to send it to me. I think that we will be looking to have a peer review publication from the all federal working group out for review, and we'd be tapping into states at that point. We have to be careful as far as like getting guidance from states or outside the federal government. So that's why we're focused on just a federal and work group to start with. But that name and that contact would be valuable for that review, or to let them know via the request of that review. But then further staying in touch, the group had talked about maybe doing kind of more of the meta barcoding or multiple species surveillance as maybe a year 2 initiative. That will depend on if it bubbles up as a priority. So there might be continued work on that. So I'd appreciate the contact, and we'll reach out to that person to stay in touch with them. And maybe Stash has anything more as far as how do we, kind of institutionalize this connection on any of the current or future work plan. It's that I believe is a little bit ad hoc, but this type of call or conversation and personal communication is probably one of the mechanisms we have currently.
Yeah, and we've done sort of a lot of that sort of one-on-one type of communications with folks that we know. With the ED&A process, the Western Regional Panel for the ANSDF has been very active, and so Adam and a bunch of the federal agencies there have been regularly interacting with folks in state agencies, and I was at the last meeting that they had, and so we use those as opportunities for to get sort of expertise, to get opinions, and to inform the work that we're doing. So certainly there, it's easy to do it sort of on an ad hoc basis, but again, it sort of takes either somebody pointing us in the right direction or us sort of otherwise finding sort of names and individuals for folks that we can talk to.
Great, thanks. Any other thoughts, questions, ideas?
I will recognize Carrie and the Northeast risk that you guys you put in the chat box here is to kind of call out the tremendous success, I think, of that. As Stash mentioned, it might be being kind of replicated in the Pacific Islands, Northwest, North Central, Southeast even. So just maybe a kudos to Carrie and that group and those of you who might be involved with it for doing something that I think has been exemplary and is now being replicated. And I think that really gets at that cycle I was talking about of research to management as a way of connecting cutting edge work with relevant management considerations. So just a hats off to you all for the work you did with that, with the Northeast risk.
Yeah, thank you. So it's interesting as you think about the aquatic nuisance species, and I don't want to dominate, so anyone else feel free to jump in, but that's focused on aquatics, and we don't really have the same structures. I know those receive federal funding. Is that right, Meg? And Jeff, and Sash, you'd probably know all that too, but the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force. And if there's any thoughts of expanding that, like you said, to other taxa to provide that kind of structure and funding that allows those to form, those regional efforts to form.
Yeah, I mean, the panels receive funding. It's been a little bit of money. It's been 40,000, and I think we just got bumped back to 50 for the first time in 4 or 5 years. So it's barely enough money to sort of operate so that we can get together, do our business, get the states together, get reports in, share information. We partner on a lot of initiatives, and then we report back to the ANS task force twice a year. So it's a small amount of money. It's not big dollars, but the ANS task force also has funding available for state-approved management plans, and New York and the Lake Champlain Basin both receive funding from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to execute the plans that have been created.
Yeah,
but it would make sense that this group in particular received, sort of regular updates or thought about how to channel information into these communications so that the voice of what's happening, particularly in the state of New York, is replicated from both the Great Lakes panel and the NEANS panel to the ANS task force.
Yeah, and I was just to add, thanks, Meg, that was sort of largely sort of codified in legislation. which is sort of a good hook to have. I think one of the difficulties has been always the amount of value that not just states, but federal agencies get out of the regional panels, I think goes well beyond the investment that goes into them. And so that, you know, one of the struggles has been, how do you basically make the case and the argument that for a modest investment, and I think there's sort of, you know, rationale in terms of folks who would like the amounts that are bumped up both for the regional panels as well as the state management plans. So to understand the value that sort of gives back to both state agencies as well as federal agencies. And that's sort of a nut that we're continually trying to crack.
With respect to other taxa as well, Terry Hogan with the National Park Service is now co-chairing FICMANU, and of course the F stands for federal. So I don't know what an entree has. It's not codified by congressional acts, but I think that they're interested in getting more engagement, just kind of at large. And so if you know Terry or you want her contact information, you can provide it. It'd be interesting, and I'm not sure where FICMANU stands on, and maybe Stash does, but as far as engaging with states, but you know, it is noxious weeds, and so there might be some interest in them, at least staying in touch with states and interested states, especially states that are being fairly exemplary and doing some good work, like New York is.
Yeah, and FICMANU does have sort of a public, do sort of federal meetings and public meetings. I think they recognize that they have not been as sort of effective as they might be in the past. And so they've been, you know, over the past couple of months, just sort of doing a little internal soul searching to figure out how can they sort of improve their own effectiveness and efficacy.
That's great. So I know that Renee had scheduled us to kind of move to action items around 11:50, but I just wanted to throw out there, this has been so helpful, again, to have this opportunity to learn about the way you're structured, your priorities, the way the NISC is moving. And I think this is great for us as an ISAC to, you know, incorporate this into our thinking and incorporate this into maybe our action items moving forward, and find ways to really, you know, share our priorities with you. I think maybe we should, Renee, or as a group, we should maybe be sharing our annual plan or report that, you know, we pulled together that has our state priorities, maybe making that available to you guys on an annual basis, so you know what, you know, as an ISAC, what we're thinking about. And I think this is a great, you know, kickoff to a conversation on how we can interface better with the national level. But does anyone else have any final wrap-up comments or thoughts?
Just wanted to throw out there, if George proceeds with any of the revisiting of Pimentel, I'd be happy to stay in touch. This is sort of like, you know, the 3 people staff that we have, we don't really have anything other than the staff, so we don't have a bucket of money to send to universities to work on something like that. But you know, if there's somebody, kind of like where we had those special issues I mentioned, if there is a paper and there's an interest in federal co-authors, we could coordinate kind of connecting to some of that. So be happy to stay in touch if that proceeds or is further explored.
That sounds great, thanks.
Yeah, and Carrie, I just sort of, you know, again, thanks for the opportunity to do this. You know, I just want us to say, you know, our you know, doors are open. Feel free to email us or give us a call. You know, in general, we think that sort of more input and information, even if it's just for context, it is very useful for us. And so, you know, we can't talk to things that we're not aware of. And so even if it's just sharing sort of the outputs of the New York Advisory Committee, I think that's a great start, and maybe it's in there when sort of we can identify the intersections of priorities, you know, for New York, or maybe it's the Northeast, and how they sort of overlay the priorities that are coming out of federal agencies, that we can really sort of figure out where the rubber might meet the road.
Yeah, thank you so much. But I think it doesn't sound like we're gonna have action items for today. I don't know if anybody wants to, you know, as far as bringing something to the council. I certainly will provide updates. I don't know what our future meetings are going to look like at this point. But anybody else have anything to add? I think this was really, really beneficial in trying to make those connections between national and state. Pretty good.
I think an action item might be to follow up on the eDNA connection between the DEC and national.
Oh, you went away a little bit there, Meredith. I think I got what you were saying with the that can be an action item. So, Christopher, if you could write that down as an action item to follow up with the connection between as far as the eDNA. I don't know how to phrase it, I guess, but
Follow up with the eDNA at the state level with the federal level and their objectives.
At least the contact, I guess there's somebody hired
Yes,
within
Stephen.
eDNA. Yes.
We can provide that
Contact.
information. I also think I might have owed you guys a copy of our comprehensive management plan. We had talked about, I think in our meeting, how New York had developed a 5-year comprehensive management plan for invasive species. I don't know if you have that, but that was created with the input from stakeholders across New York State, including the advisory committee and the council. So that might be another way for you to get a glimpse into some of the New York priorities and actions. And so that could be another action item. But
yeah, even just sharing that plan, but also on a yearly basis, we can make it, that we share our work plan for ISAC. We have a 2-year work plan, and then also we do an annual report. So
those would all be useful. And I think just one other note, we'll certainly sort of share links to the documents that I previously mentioned. I should also note that going back a couple years, the Federal Invasive Species Advisory Committee put together a paper on the federal state coordination. And so it's looking at basically state level issues within the federal context. A lot of interesting ideas there. I think at present we don't really have the capacity to act on that, but it might be sort of useful food for thought in terms of some of the ideas in terms of how states can interact with feds, but also, if we get to sort of glory days and get sort of additional capacity at some point, whether those are the types of activities that New York would be supportive in terms of thinking about interactions between states and the council. So I will send a link to that white paper that our ISAC put together as well, just for food for thought.
great. That would be helpful. We can maybe take a look at that as a group and brainstorm on that as well. Okay.
Christopher, you got both of those action items? Should be
The
two.
second one broke up a little bit. Would you get the second one, please, real quick?
So the second one will be that we'll share with NISC our invasive species management plan. And then on a yearly basis, we'll share right now, but on a yearly basis, also share our work plan and our annual report.
And then I also think there was the white paper on states interacting with NISC. So we can think about that.
So that'll be a third one, yeah. So third one, Chris, would be what Carrie just said.
Yeah, with states interacting with NISC.
Yeah, the white paper.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. So I guess, is there anything else anyone would like to add on that or on our action items? All right.
We could sign off. I don't know if you guys have other work to kind of conclude that.
No, we're good. Yeah, you can sign up, both of you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for taking the time. That was really great.
Yeah, appreciate the opportunity for sure.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Good to see you.
So right before we end our ISAC meeting, just kind of for a wrap up. So we have some of the action items. Chris will work on the minutes. We'll send that out. Also send out some of this other documents that we talked about and email it to everybody. As far as the next meeting, we'll see. You know, we had planned on October 1st, but we'll see how things go with if we have to do another virtual or if we can do in person. Who knows? Hopefully, we'll have a joint meeting with the council at some point. We're hoping to invite council members to this meeting, but one thing we can certainly provide the recording of this meeting to the council members and provide an update at our next council meeting on how things went with this presentation and discussion, which was really great. And but you know, maybe in the fall we can have either a virtual or in-person meeting with the council, and certainly we can discuss this presentation and also, you know, the management plan goals. There's other topics we can bring up, but we'll see what happens. But it was great to have this virtual meeting. I think it's good that we made an effort to, you know, still have this meeting with everything going on, and you know, keep the discussion going and the connection going. But so that's all I have. Anybody else have anything else to add before we end?
Thank you, Renee. Nice meeting.
Thank you. Excellent.
Oh, it's great to see all of you and hear your voices. Stay healthy, everybody. Thanks a lot.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
You
Thank
too.
you.